Hello and welcome to today's event. My name is Sharon Yoon and I am Assistant Professor of Korean Studies at the Keough School of Global Affairs and a Faculty Fellow of the Liu Institute for Asia and Asian Studies at the University of Notre Dame. The Liu Institute is one of 9 international institutes that make up the Keough School of Global Affairs. The Institute's main objectives are to coordinate Asian studies research and teaching across the university, to encourage Notre Dame students to study in Asia, to promote collaboration with Asian universities, and to organize public events pertaining to Asia. This academic year, the Institute is hosting a series titled Asian Revisions of Nation, State, and Citizenship that invites scholars from multiple disciplines to examine how diverse populations in Asia are remaking discourses and practices of nation, state, and citizenship with consequences for people in Asia and around the globe. On behalf of the Liu Institute and my fellow organizers of the series, Professors Julia Kowalski and Kyle Jaros, I'm pleased to introduce Professor Nadia Kim for today's lecture. Dr. Kim is currently Professor of Sociology and Asian American Studies at Loyola Marymount University, and she's considered one of the most well-known scholars analyzing US race and citizenship inequalities in the Korean American community, including in particular the 1992 LA racial uprisings. She also studies the intersections of environmental activism, race, and gender in the US. She is perhaps most well known for her first book, Imperial Citizens, Koreans and Race from Seoul to LA, which was published by Stanford University Press in 2008. Imperial Citizens won 2 book awards from American Sociological Association in 2009, including the Book of the Year Award from the Asia and Asian American section, as well as the Oliver Cox Book Award from the Racial and Ethnic Minorities section. Professor Kim is a distinguished scholar who has also won 2 early career awards, as well as several prestigious awards for single and co-authored journal articles from the American Sociological Association. She has published extensively in top academic outlets, such as Social Forces, Social Problems, International Migration Review, and the Du Bois Review. And she's also a public intellectual whose work has been featured prominently in media outlets such as NPR, Southern California Public Radio, Radio Korea, the Washington Post, the Chronicle of Higher Education, the Boston Globe, the Korea Times, and Nylon Magazine. Her lecture today is titled, Our Community Has Boundaries, LA's Immigrant Women Activists on Embodiment, Race, Class, and Morality. This lecture highlights key findings from her newest book, Refusing Death, Immigrant Women and the Fight for Environmental Justice in LA, which was just recently published by Stanford University Press. During the event, if you have questions, please submit them using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And now with great pleasure, I yield the floor to Professor Nadia Kim.
Thanks so much, Professor Sharon Yoon. Thanks so much to Notre Dame's Liu Institute for Asia and Asian Studies. I'm very excited to be speaking to you today. I wish I could have been there in person, but Delta and mutations had other plans, so in the future, someday. All right, so let me just set my timer so I make sure I don't go way over time. But to echo what Professor Yoon just said, some of the aspects of my talk, I won't really get to develop too much just because you have to be selective about the 45 minutes. So I encourage you to consult that. All proceeds go to the community organizations that I'll be discussing today. All right, so the first thing I want to do is share my presentation. And I just want to let you know that I did actually change the title slightly. Oh, sorry, I don't know why it's not going to the first. I changed the title slightly just to highlight the fact that these are Asian and Latina immigrants that I'm focusing on today. Okay, so I think it's really important to answer the why does this matter question, especially to contextualize what I'll be sharing. So the first reason why this topic matters is because we scholars and practitioners need to understand that there is no racism without addressing environmental racism, okay? There is no classism or class injustice without understanding the environmental nature of that. And that includes both the built and the natural environment. And if we are to grasp all parts of climate justice, we need to understand the way in which environmental injustice in our rural and urban communities are a central part of something that we tend to think of more globally, okay? So locally is how we should be thinking, right? And given the climate catastrophe and all the ways we're seeing it manifest left and right, we do need to ring that alarm, as iconic Beyonce would say. Also, one of the reasons why this matters is because of violence and neglect, which are often interrelated, from neoliberal racial capitalism, which I'll be elaborating on in a moment, and because of the rise in anti-immigrant nationalism and nativism, immigrants, including unauthorized immigrants, increasingly rely on grassroots community activism as a way to affect political change. And those that are at the helm of these community movements tend to be women of color, immigrant women of color, many of whom are unauthorized. Immigrant-led movements are among the most dynamic in our global cities. They are changing the political landscape, but they're relatively unknown. As an example of the importance of this matter, we can't even grasp the COVID-19 pandemic without centering environmental racism and classism. And that's because the reason that Black, Brown, Pacific Islander, Indigenous communities are hospitalized and dying at the highest rates from COVID-19 have to do with the ways that their bodies are already compromised by environmental pollution. So my general research question that prompted much of the study of my book was, when it comes to environmental justice, how does having unhealthy bodies determine the political boundary lines that the Asian and Latina immigrant activists draw? And how do race, and that includes nation, class, immigration, gender, and the like, shape these political views, identities, and strategies? Okay, so I was asking this broader question that led me to some complex findings. So what were my data and methods? I did, first of all, about 3.5 years of ethnographic participant observation, okay? So not only did I attend as many meetings and events and protests and public comments and presentations and social events as I could, but I also offered to organize with them whenever and however it made sense. I also did about 50 interviews with activists, leaders, members, and allies, including detached allies of 5 community-based organizations and 3 supplementary CBOs. Many of them worked separately from each other. So the mostly Mexican-American, but other Latinx ethnic centered organizations were Long Beach Alliance for Children with Asthma, LABACA, Community Partners Council, CPC, Coalition for a Safe Environment, CFASI, and the supplementary organizations that I informally worked with, but are quite well known in the LA area, are East Yard Communities for Environmental Justice, or EYCEJ, and organizations like Semillas de Esperanza, Seeds of Hope, SE, and Latinos in Action, LIA. Now, these organizations mostly served predominantly Latinx communities that were working class, a lot of undocumented immigrants working in these communities, living in these communities. And another organization that tended to work more in the city of Carson and nearby Los Angeles was People's Corps, or P-Corps. This is a Filipinx American organization that worked on environmental justice, but like the Latinx organizations, also worked on other issues like housing rights and advocating for veterans, and ensuring community-centered approaches to empowering these Filipinx Americans. Now, another group that I worked with that's very well known, probably the most well known in not just the California area, but in terms of environmental justice broadly, is Communities for a Better Environment, or CBE. I worked with them mostly in the Wilmington community, but they're also based north of Wilmington, and they're also based in Northern California. And they tend to have a more multiracial activist staff, but the communities that they're advocating for in Wilmington and the rest of Los Angeles tend to be mostly Latinx, but also Asian Pacific Islander, also Black American. So it tends to have a little bit more of a diffuse multiracial focus. The last thing I wanted to say about the demographics is that the Carson area, where the Filipinx People's Corps worked, tended to be more middle class. And so there is that class difference as well that exists between the Filipinx Americans and the Latinx constituents. Okay, so the final method that I used was documents analysis. So I analyzed hundreds and hundreds of pages of agendas, all the way to presentations, just as a way to more fully understand the issues at hand and the way that they're being framed. Okay, so just to give you a brief, and it will have to be brief, overview of the environmental issues that face all of us, actually, because as many of you know, the United States is no longer a manufacturing economy, okay? Starting in about the 70s, 80s, with deindustrialization, we now have exported most of our manufacturing jobs. And so all the goods that you and I buy, from cars to food, have to be shipped in for the most part, a lot of it, not all of it, but the majority of it. And it gets shipped in from China and other manufacturing nations. And so if you look on the bottom right here, that is a port, okay? And a lot of our global cities have these ports. So not just Los Angeles, but Seattle, also New York, New Jersey, Houston, okay? And so the cargo ships that bring in a lot of these goods, big and small, at our big box stores, come in on a diesel run ships, okay? And then they're loaded, often after idling for hours and days, onto trains, so the top left, and onto big trucks, right, on the right, top right. And these travel throughout the nation, not just locally, but throughout the nation, to deliver these goods. So this apparatus is called goods movement. So in fact, some of the goods that you're purchasing in Indiana came from LA and Long Beach, okay, the port of LA and Long Beach, which is the 5th largest in the world. Now, in order to uphold this goods movement apparatus, and everything that's made requires oil, you have in this bottom left picture the oil refineries, and you can see that they abut these neighborhoods, these residential communities. And so people of color, immigrants of color, are increasingly residing in or near, working in or near this goods movement and oil refinery complex, okay? So just to give you a sense of how large these ports are, they look like cities unto themselves. This is the port of Los Angeles. Next to it is that of Long Beach. And so it is expansive, to say the least. just to orient you on the map, all of you are probably familiar with, in some way, shape, or form, LAX, which is at the top, right? And where you see what I like to call this kind of this port industrial belt is right around here. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor. I'm assuming you can. But it's right around here. So the city of Carson that I mentioned, where a lot of the Filipinx American and other AAPI activists focus on and where they come from, is right here. And as you can see, it's surrounded by all of these major freeways, the 110, the 405, the 710, right? For those of you who are familiar with LA, right? We organize our lives based on freeways. And this is also a concentration of oil refineries, okay? Now, Wilmington, like I mentioned, the working class Latinx community is right here, also surrounded by all these freeways, oil refineries, but also even closer than Carson to the port of Los Angeles and Long Beach, which I just showed you, and that would be right here, okay? Okay, so one of the first things that I wanted to go over was the power that oil and gas and regulatory agencies have. And I write emotive power because one of the signal tactics that oil and gas and these quote unquote regulatory agencies use is to feign an ethics of care, an ethics of concern, right? Which is actually co-opting and taking from the environmental justice movement, which has very much used this language of care and concern for our neighbors, for marginalized people, for the communities that are often not celebrated in the shadows. And this has been an environmental justice movement that has often been women-led, right? And because women are often socialized to care about other people, to nurture, and to focus on the collective, that this is an ethics that oil and gas and the agencies that are supposed to regulate them have basically co-opted, right? We care about you and your community. We care about you and the environment. And the reason why I bring this up as well is because we can't really understand neoliberal tactics until we really grasp that a system of neoliberalism relies on even this kind of language and discourse. So just to provide a quick and broad definition of neoliberalism, I would just say that it's an extreme form of laissez-faire, runaway capitalism that leads to very extremist individualism, right? So offshoots of this form of neoliberalism is the fact that we have gutted the social welfare state, and allowed for the abandonment, essentially the neglect of everyday people, right? So that the 1% Wall Street can basically just run away with wealth. Okay. Racism, sexism, etc., nativism are fundamental to that, because as you can see, immigrants, people of color, they're targeted, right, for all the social ills that come from neoliberalism. But of course, all the social welfare programs that are designed mostly to assist them are now being gutted, okay? So regulatory is in quotes because one of the other major features of neoliberalism is that agencies, government institutions that are meant to regulate, for example, oil and gas or Wall Street or diesel, right, are incredibly weak, okay? And regulation is weak. And this is the conundrum that these activists face today, okay? So as far as the extreme individualism part, I can't think of a better example than people that refuse to mask because they don't care about saving other people's lives, okay? Now, the other aspect, neoliberal tactic that these immigrants face is that oil and gas or the agencies will claim to be fixing this problem of hyper pollution, but they pretend that they didn't even create the very problem, right? And so they take undue credit for all the ways in which they're making the environment better. Another element of neoliberalism is false choices. So a really great example is the fact that these immigrant women, many of whom are mothers, also are involved in school reform. And so they often actually, in a very unique way, bridge both environmental justice organizing with organizing for school reform. And that's because the two issues often overlap. So many of their children's schools are actually built right next to freeways or right next to oil refineries and other major polluting industries. And so their children get asthma at early ages or they get quite sick. And so the false choices under neoliberalism is, okay, well, either you can have a school built right next to a freeway because that'll be walkable for many of you, since many of you are carless, or we would have to build a school far away that you would not be able to walk to because it's not located near oil and gas or near the freeway. Okay, these are false choices, right? Our world doesn't have to be this way. It's just that for the imperative of profit, that's often the kinds of choices we're left with, right? One great example of this ethics of care, right? And there's many that I state in my book, but Valero Oil cares about you and the earth, according to their website, because they will trumpet that they are ranked highest among independent refiners in Newsweek's 2017 green rankings of the top 500 US publicly traded companies for environmental performance. I think the irony of this is not lost on you or I. This is like Coca-Cola saying that, they're ranked in the top health rankings of US publicly traded companies. Okay, so this unself-consciousness, right, of these contradictions, I think is a part of this kind of like normalization of neoliberal language and discourse and this ethics of care, right? A great example, I think, also of the false choices is the infamous case of Suva Elementary, where you can see this chrome plating company is literally blowing toxins and carcinogens onto these children while they're at school. This was happening such that in the 80s and 90s, people and students and teachers were being diagnosed with cancer, miscarrying babies, and up to this day, about 28 people have contracted cancer. Several students and teachers have already died, okay? So one of the interesting ways in which the immigrant activists with whom I worked conceive of these issues in this context is to think about embodiment in multiple ways. So clearly, when people are sick and dying prematurely because of all of this hyperpollution, and kids are getting asthma very, very young, they are going to center the physical body, right? But one of the ways in which these activists think about embodiment is that they connect it to their identities. They bring in issues of race, class, and community in ways that I think are quite nuanced and interesting and effective in terms of their political resistance. So this first example comes from Johnny, who is an unauthorized Guatemalan youth leader for Communities for a Better Environment. And when I asked him about what he thinks of environmental justice, this was his response, and I'll finish up the remainder of the quote. He said, environmental justice is not an identity, right? People don't see that as an identity like being Guatemalteco or Chicano, but to me it is. It has so much to do with where I live, where I grew up in the US. That's why I hold environmental justice dear to my heart. EJ allowed me to do that without having to focus on just one identity. It's that I'm part of my community, my environment, my surroundings, which is not just pollution, by the way. I can't take it away from me. Okay. And I think this is such an instructive narrative because it shows that usually think of identity as the identity politics of race, class, gender, etc., right? But what he's saying is that my identity politics is environmental justice. And that's in large part because I can't take my community out of my body, right? That both the illness, the sickness, the pollution, but also the beauty of that community is me. And so this sense of embodiment, I think, is quite important in understanding the way that these activists draw boundary lines around us, the community, and them, right? The elites, the corporate and government elites, right? And all the Americans that support them, right? So this is how I got to thinking about race and class and embodiments coming together. And in talking more to the activists, they also brought in tropes about morality, okay? So what I found and what I'll flesh out for you is that these activists drew boundaries around their community as embodying classism or racism by way of hyperpollution, right? So their experience is of an embodied classism and of an embodied racism. And as part of that embodiment, they were also talking about emotional inequalities as well. So as we saw before, you see oil and gas and the regulators deploying this kind of emotive discourse, this affective discourse about we care, we're concerned, right? And that drives our corporate and state practices. And so they're very attuned to that. And so they're also attuned to the way embodiment is also about that emotional inequality, but also the ways in which they're suffering emotionally. And they have to marshal their own emotional reserves to fight, right? And to resist. Now, their fighting and their resisting, they see as a form of moral citizenship, okay? The kind of citizenship that is not voting and running for office and owning property, but it's the kind of citizenship that has been abdicated by neoliberalism, by those at the top, right? Which is to care for your neighbor, right? It's just to care for your community, especially under a regime of violence and neglect, okay? So when they talk about the healthy, wealthy, or the white healthy, on the other side of that boundary line, they're also claiming their immorality, okay? And I'll address that in a moment. Now, what was also interesting that I'll be explaining today is when I asked, okay, to the mostly Filipina and other AAPI Asian Americans, what is most important in explaining environmental injustices and all of these inequalities that you've been describing of the body, of emotions. The Asian American said racism was most salient. Okay, so we'll be exploring why that is. When I talked to the Latinx activists, they actually said classism was most salient, and that was quite surprising to me. So I'm going to start with the Latinx immigrants and this issue of identifying classism as the most important injustice and dividing line. Okay. One of the major ways in which they described this had to do with their own transnational livelihood between Mexico and the United States, and their own transnational kind of cultural logic, right? And what they would say when I would ask, do you think it's because they're mostly Anglo and you're mostly Latinx that they are over contaminating your communities? This is what Marta had to say, who's an unauthorized Mexican immigrant, okay? She said, it's not just because they're Anglo. Over there in Mexico, we are Mexican, and it's the same thing when there's politics. They don't pay attention to us. To put it simply, they're people who are not in a lower class like us. They separate themselves from us and they don't know the people. They live near the mountain and they forget about us, okay? So I think this is really instructive that she says it's not really about being of different racial backgrounds, because in Mexico they did the exact same thing to us. She says it's because we are in a lower class, okay? So that transnational experience of poverty, that transnational experience of class injustice is what many of these immigrants referred to when I asked them why the suffering in LA. Okay, so another example comes from Celia. She had mentioned that both she and her parents weren't interested in politics, formal politics in Mexico. And I asked her why. And she said, well, what happens is that where I'm from is a very small town, and there, whoever was the one with the most money would just go and make themselves the leader, the political leader. And I asked, but did the person who made the rules, were they a good person who did things with justice? Or, and she replied, sometimes, depending on the money. And, you know, gives me a wry smile, right? So again, there's this very strong notion that class injustices drive, you know, the political landscape, okay? And so that's why they make that linkage to the United States. So this is why when at first I made this assumption that they would be talking about us Latinos, us Mexicans, especially given the environmental justice literature showing that often environmental racism is the major reason why disproportionate contamination is, you know, visited upon these communities. And instead, what they showed is that embodied classism really drew the lines around my community and them. Right. So this is an example of when I talked with Lauda. I said, when you say community, do you mean the people who live in the specific area? Or, and Lauda said, no, not only us immigrants, it's low income. I'm not talking about Latinos, Black, or other racial ethnic groups who live here. Another example comes from a very short quip from Ceci, who is a leader in the community who later became naturalized over the course of my research. And what's interesting about the comment she makes here is that, again, the focus on the wealthy, right? Bespeaks the notion that the wealthy are healthy physically, but also emotionally. The wealthy are ignorant, and the wealthy are not empathic, because in this instance, right before Ceci makes this statement, I had experienced with her a regulatory official getting really exasperated with all these immigrant women of color coming up talking about their cancers, right, and their children's asthma. And so he kind of angrily said during the public comment, you guys are not the only ones who get cancer, you know, I had cancer, right, to which all of us were shocked. And given this, you know, women-led movement who are really concerned about an ethics of care, when I asked her about, you know, that angry statement that the regulatory official made, Ceci replied, you know what? He has no idea what it's like to be me with cancer because he is rich. Okay. So as another testament to this notion of the wealthy being healthy, also emotionally, that they're ignorant, that they're not empathic, which is, you know, considered immoral in the eyes of these immigrant women. This was an exchange with Lauda where she had just told me that she likes Obama. She's not exactly sure why, but as far as formal politics, you know, she invoked Obama. And so I asked her if she'd ever focus more on electoral politics once she became naturalized. And she said, never. My community is first. It's because the community needs to be educated. We need to include ourselves. So I asked, do you feel like Obama or like the national level representatives, do they know local issues? And she scoffs immediately and says, no, they have no idea because they live in places where they don't know anything about pollution. Okay, so again, those at the national level of politics, Obama, they're wealthy, they're ignorant, and they have no idea. So there were other factors, and I'm going to go through this quickly, that led to these immigrant activists pinpointing classism as the main source of environmental injustice, but also as the main dividing line between the kind of embodied lives that they live and those that we live. One of the reasons they might not go to race and racism is because none of the immigrant activists were members of the racially marginalized in Mexico. So that includes the indigenous, that includes the smaller numbers of Afro and Asian Mexicans in Mexico. They were all mestizo, right? Race talk in Latin America, including Mexico, is quite different, as some of you may know. It is much more about identifying race only in its most extreme and egregious cases. So examples would be the KKK. As far as these immigrants drawing also on global transnational immigrant rights, immigrant workers' rights discourse, I do think that that was quite true, because oftentimes they would invoke, you know, there are human rights for workers all over the world, many of whom are now immigrants, right? And then finally, their experience in the United States is that it didn't offer the class mobility that they had hoped for in many cases, right? They might not have been as poor and experiencing the grinding poverty that they did in Mexico, but it certainly wasn't the mobility that they were expecting. So that just reinforces class injustices. They were also quite segregated from white America because they lived in predominantly Latinx communities. Obviously, they do engage with white America through the politics and you know, working in their homes or near their homes, but you know, that there wasn't that everyday sustained engagement of white America, which often breeds less race-focused political sentiments, as researchers have shown. So with the Filipinx community, they would argue that, yes, it is environmental racism, right? And they often led with our Filipino community are being polluted upon, right? We minorities, we people of color. They would obviously invoke class, but they would never lead with class, right? They led with race. And one of the ways we saw this is that they rarely organize an environmental justice event without centering Philam or Panay Pinoy history and culture. So there would always be Filipinx food, civic awards for Filipinx leaders or high achieving students or veterans. And for example, I helped organize with them an environmental justice, you know, protest that also centered Larry Itliong, right? Larry Itliong is pictured here. For those of you who don't know him, you know, he was the one actually with Philip Vera Cruz and other Manongs to convince Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta to engage in a massive strike and a massive boycott, okay? But they often don't get that credit because of the erasure of Asian American history. But in so doing, Larry Itliong is also an environmental justice crusader, because he advocated for no more spraying of DDT and other cancerous pesticides on farm workers. He advocated for organic produce also, so that that would cut down on the stillborns and miscarriages and deaths of farm workers. Okay, and so you see this importance placed on racial and ethno-racial culture and heritage. Okay, and this is Pia, who we'll meet right now. One of the other reasons transnationally that explained leading with racism was US neocolonialism. And as Pia describes here, that is what made her family political. That is what allowed her to engage in social movements in the Philippines. And that is what allowed her to engage with ongoing transnational movements between the Philippines and Carson, LA, etc. So Pia said, my dad was a union leader. I grew up debating politics. My political position was mainly in the student movement in the 70s, fighting Marcos. I was already active with the women's movement. In '84, I was setting up Gabriela, which is a renowned NGO that advocated for women's issues. Right now, because we live in Carson, I'm more interested in the environment because I can feel the impact. The Philippine network pulled out when the US military bases also pulled out in '92. When they pulled out, we felt that it was necessary to put up an environment group because the human rights had gone hand in hand with the environmental issue. And I asked, are you saying because the bases had polluted so much? Yeah. And though we were wanting to do just international military issues, we got pulled in because Greenpeace came in and talked about plastics, that the global north dumps all their plastics in the Philippines. They dump batteries, the pesticides go there. They dump all the tobacco from here over there, right? So one of the major differences between the AAPI activists and the Latinx activists was that the AAPI activists had very much been active prior to immigrating to the United States. And that's in part afforded by some of their middle class backgrounds, right? that Latinx immigrants said they often had to focus on survival, but they did consider political all of the volunteering and the mutual assistance they gave to their communities. But the Mexican immigrants really became social justice activists once they came to the United States, when they came to LA, and their kids were getting really sick and their neighbors were as well, right? And the difference also was that the Mexican immigrants were not engaged in transnational movements between Mexico and LA, in large part because they were very depressed by the state of politics in Mexico, okay? And because they hadn't forged that linkage prior to immigrating. The other factors that helped explain the pinpointing of racism by the AAPI activists also had to do with, in general, they had longer tenures in the United States, and therefore they had more US-based activist experience as well, which tends to center race and racism more as a political identity. They were also more fluent in English, which also enables more engagement with various movements and access to information about what's going on politically. The fact that many of them were middle class, though not exclusively, meant that they had more frequent and intense engagement of white America in the workplace, in the neighborhoods like Carson. And as I said earlier, that often fosters more race-centered explanations for why injustices occur, okay, why there's inequality, okay. Now, of course, race and class matter. So this is not at all to argue that, for example, the Latinx immigrants, didn't see race as mediated by class, right? Or that they were, completely focused on that transnational class injustice that they lived. So Celia is an example. When I asked, why do you think that they disproportionately pollute your community? She said, it can be because they might think that immigrants only come to take from the country and not give to the country. So I said, so sometimes do you think it has to do with being Latino and she said, yes, okay. In the same way, the AAPI activists, they obviously integrated class with race, and oftentimes they saw race as mediating class. So an example of me talking to Cindy, who's a Samoan American teacher who worked with People's Corps, I said, why do you think they disproportionately pollute on Carson? And she said, well, in part, it's because America has false images of Samoans as just being uneducated football players. So her concern here is not just that Samoan Americans are seen as football players, but that they're seen as uneducated, right? And she quickly follows that up with, in my family, there was no question about going to college. There was no question about, being productive. So she ties college education to productivity, okay? So what are the implications of the findings of my research? One of the interesting things that I reckoned with as a race scholar is, can university theorists be too race focused when street theorists might not always be so, right? So the Latinx activists were the ones who were really focused on class injustice, right? As being the main beast to slay, right? And the main moral beast to slay, okay? And the main dividing line between, the embodied lives of them and us. And I just, it really made me think about how sometimes our theoretical and our intellectual orientations and language might be too disengaged from or divorced from what the people who live these kinds of injustices, like pollution, injustice on the ground, how they might interpret it, right? And how they might understand alternative possibilities. So one example is that they really understood legalization through a class lens, insofar as they didn't necessarily say, okay, it's because of racism that, they're not legalizing us. It's because all those wealthy people that make those decisions don't care about the poor or are so unempathic. And so they argued that if those elites just legalized us, we would have all of this class opportunity, right? We would have socioeconomic opportunity. Sorry for that. And so they really saw that, you know, class would be the main victory, right? That came from legalization. Now, one of the other aspects of this finding that I found interesting is that they didn't really invoke capitalism explicitly. So they would often use the language that's akin to capitalist critique, right? So we shouldn't put profit over people. We need to have economic justice. You know, that would solve a lot of our problems, right? But, you know, interestingly enough, perhaps it's because of the way in which capitalism, right? One of the reasons it gets sustained is because the United States, for example, pretends it's a classless society, right? Or it's just invisible, right? It's just erased. But I wonder if capitalism had been more of the centerpiece, right, of their politics, you know, would that have brought race into the picture? But all of these, I ask all these questions because, you know, I definitely was taken aback by the lack of emphasis on race and racism, or on us Latinos, right? The other implication of my findings is that we do need more interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary work. That was the only way I came to my findings. And so, for example, it's by having engaged sociology, including the EJ literature, American studies, ethnic studies, that I recognize that both sociology and primarily the sociology of environmental justice scholarship need to be more embodied, affective, transnational, empire and citizenship focused, as well as center neoliberalism, okay? But on the other hand, I would argue that American and ethnic studies haven't developed environmental justice studies enough, and they could really draw on social science methods, I think, to do really scintillating work that brings in sort of the humanities, the literature, the historical, the cultural focus, but also the social science focus. I do believe that all of these disciplines are still too methodologically nationalistic, meaning that in our frameworks, it's important and useful to broaden beyond LA, for example, or broaden beyond the bounded United States, not to think of it as a bounded figuration, but to really think about the way globalization and transnationality are lived through these immigrants. It doesn't even have to be literally, but just symbolically, right? Or emotionally, right? Politically, symbolically, politically, right? Like, I think that that's actually quite important. And I would like to encourage scholars to go in that direction. For example, one thing that I thought of, given what the Latinx immigrants said about class injustice, you know, a future research study could be someone really analyzing closely class discourse around the poor in Mexico, right? And does that converge with the class discourse we have about the poor and Latinx immigrants who are lower income in the United States? You know, what kinds of effects might that have? Okay. But overall, you know, and I didn't get to develop this as much in this talk today, but I think one of the lessons that we learn from these immigrant activists on the ground, right, living this pollution and the sickness and premature death as a result, is that our definition and our practice of politics, our definition, our practice of citizenship should center in ethics of care, especially under the violence and neglect of neoliberalism. Thank you so much for your time. I really, really appreciate it. And I'm going to stop share right now.
Thank you
Oh,
so
thanks for that. Oh, thanks, Sharon. Yeah, you guys can see the cursor. Good, good.
So we have some questions that are already in our queue.
Yeah.
So I think I'll go ahead. If you guys can also send in more questions, we'll be sure to get to them. So the first questions that we have are actually pre-submitted.
Okay.
One person asked, on top of LA, what's your sense of environmental justice issues in Baltimore, as
Oh.
well as more kind of nationally?
Yeah. I don't know as much about Baltimore per se, but I do know about, generally the East Coast. And the same issues are actually going on there as well, right? Because you have a lot of urban centers on the East Coast. Um, and so the asthma epidemic, as it afflicts African American, Black American communities, but also Latinx communities and Asian communities out there, is also quite salient. So some of the strongest environmental justice movements have been around asthma. And what's also really heartening is that there's been even more community organizing because of the connection that these activists are making between COVID, why there's been so much COVID hospitalization and death in their communities, and that long-standing environmental over pollution of their communities, right? So a really good example, when I was visiting a professor in New York, South Bronx is getting really active on that issue. And again, women and mothers are also getting involved, okay, advocating for their children and their families. Now, another way that there's a parallel is that the ports, right? So there's the Port Authority, right? New York, New Jersey, right? And these other cities like Houston, Seattle, they have these same ports. So they're also experiencing this disproportionate diesel pollution. And it tends to be that, white, wealthier Americans are not living right by the port industrial complex, right? So it tends to afflict people of color and immigrants of color disproportionately. The other element of that is the oil apparatuses, right, that we need to do all of this goods movement apparatus, the goods movement. But there was one other thing I was going to say, and it's escaping me, but maybe I'll remember. Oh, freeways, right? We talk about Robert E. Lee and the Confederate statues as among our most racist monuments in our country, but actually some people would argue that freeways are, okay, freeways and highways, okay, because they're built often in communities of color, right? And they often destroy communities of color by virtue of being built. And as I shared in my talk, they're usually built right by some of the most valued institutions in our society, schools, right? Hospitals, senior centers, so that's also another way in which there's a parallel.
Great, thank you. So I have a few questions in the queue. Alina Reed, she asks, in the research I have done on pollution in LA, most activists seem to be lobbying for access to medication for children with asthma.
Yeah.
Do you believe that this is an appropriate response, or do you see a better solution?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, that was definitely part of the activism that these immigrants did in LA. Is so some people call it environmental health justice, right? That I think if you can be multi-pronged, I think it's fine, because one of the ways in which the immigrant women in particular that I was addressing today, that they've changed the medical industry in LA is to force doctors and medical staff to understand the environmental causes of asthma, lung diseases, right, and cancers, right? So prior to these immigrants organizing, they would go to these doctors and the doctors would know nothing about the socio-environmental causes of why these kids and these neighbors were sick. And so by virtue of activism on the grassroots level, but also bringing in their partnerships with universities. So this is a great way we can think about engaged partnerships between university and the community, which I think more of us should be doing. And I just think this era of political revolution is pointing us in that direction, is that the universities would show through their studies and their research, look, even living within 1 mile of the freeway is not just causing asthma, but it's causing heart disease, right? I mean, things that people never thought of were linked. And it's that kind of partnership that also revealed to the medical industry that what is a cause of obesity? Well, it's not just Coca-Cola, like I was joking earlier, but it's also caused by environmental pollution. And I address in my book that we need to think broadly about embodiment, right? Because one of the reasons why obesity rates are high among these communities of color is because they can't really exercise outside, right? Or they can't really go outside as much as people who live in cleaner environments. At their schools, what do they often face? They face brownouts and blackouts and, lack of recess. So lack of physical activity or lowered physical activity. So, these are, if it's multi-pronged, I think that's an okay solution. But if that's the only thing that they're doing to try to fight, environmental injustice, then my answer would be no, right?
Mm. So in a way, it like seeps through every aspect of life.
Every aspect is interrelated, right?
Mhm.
Um, if there is no walkable city, right, then everybody's driving. If everybody's driving, then there's more pollution in the air. If there are low-income people who are carless, they have to breathe all of that in because they don't have cars, right?
Mm.
If you have buses running on diesel, right? So schools, bus stops, right? It's everything, right?
So we have Anthony Kim has asked two questions. The first question is, do problems related to environmental justice originate mainly from large corporations and companies intentionally polluting low-income areas?
Mhm.
How does the general middle to upper class public play a role in perpetuating environmental injustice? And he
Yeah.
also asks a question about your first book, Imperial Citizen, which we read in class.
Okay.
Said, in your book, Imperial Citizens, most of your points are built on the premise that anti-Asian racism exists due to the continuing power of the United States over Asians within their homeland states. I think
Yeah.
he means like in terms of the military bases. Does
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
premise imply or suggest that you believe that countries like South Korea, despite being a democratic first world economy, are puppet states of the US?
Oh, that's a great question. Okay. All right. So let me start with your first one. The first question is, yeah, do they pollute intentionally? Yeah. The short answer to that is yes. Do they do it with the desire and hope of killing people? No. But do they know what their toxins and carcinogens are? Do they know the gravity, right, and the severity and the danger of their toxins and carcinogens? Yes, right. And do they know that communities of color, lower income communities of color, right, they tend to be next to or near their industry? Yes, right. So one of the ways in which I write my book is to invoke Foucault, right? And I critique Foucault as well. But I think one of the brilliant arguments of Foucault is that part of the way that the dominant classes, dominant races, right, preserve themselves, right, is to basically justify and enact the deaths, right, of the lower races, right, or the lower peoples. And so every corporation from BP Arco to, Marathon Oil or whatever it is, and the agencies that are meant to regulate them, which they don't because that's a staple of neoliberalism, is, they allow a certain number of deaths, right? That's in their reporting, that's in their calculations, right? So, for example, in Wilmington, one of the communities I studied, they were supposed to only allow, I believe it was like 1 in 1 million cases of cancer. But in Wilmington, the rate was 1 in 1,000. I mean, and so it just, they're very aware of this. So the answer would be yes. And I think how upper and middle class people hold this up is, mostly by virtue of only caring about your own condition, only caring about Beverly Hills and Palos Verdes and even, Culver City, places like that, like being cleaner, and not caring that your ability to live here and reside here and have that cleaner air is contingent on industry and ports and all of that being placed near someone else. And I also think it has to do with consumer capitalism, right? Our constant need to consume, in part because we base it on status, or we base it on, giving us a higher sense of self-worth, and the incredible amounts of diesel and oil and waste, right, that promotes. And I don't mean to individualize these issues, because especially under neoliberalism, when everything's individualized, I don't want to do that. But at the same time, it is the demand, right, that leads to all of those ships and trains and trucks and oil and all of that, right? So if we think of it more broadly in a macro level, then we recognize that we all play a part, right? Just like wearing a mask means that we are doing something for the collective, right? And so I do think that NIMBYism and the consumer capitalist kind of ethos, that practice, that is how the middle and upper class uphold it. Okay, now to move to the second question. Thank you. Puppet states might be a little extreme of a conceptualization, because Korea now has arrived, right? The 11th largest economy, the most wired country in the world. But because of that North-South divide, and the threat of the North, therefore making the South Korean state, the ROK, dependent on the US military and the US state. And also, let's face it, South Korean capitalism is also dependent on what goes on with US capitalism. And they have the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, as the NAFTA of Asia. They're not a puppet state, but what I would argue is that they still are dependent, and have to answer to and negotiate to the US state as a result. Now, one of the things I argue in my book is that, yes, it is in large part that the US crafted, racist discourse and practices about Asian Americans because of colonialism, imperialism, wars, militarization in lots of Asian nations. But I also do think it's specific to the US domestic context, right? In that, for example, Koreans are triangulated vis-a-vis white and Black Americans in Korea because of US imperialism, but the discourse of the model minority, right, that happens in the US. So I do think we need to be addressing both together.
Okay, great. So we have an anonymous question. The person says, you have noted that more multidisciplinary work is necessary to addressing complex social issues, racial justice, environmental justice. What more can universities do to encourage multidisciplinary scholarship that addresses social challenges?
Yeah, that's a great question. Maybe not to think specifically in unitary discipline, like to sort of think about it as, now how we have like integrated kind of units, right? Where, for example, I think now we're seeing more of like race, indigeneity, migration, so that's an example of where you bring in sociology, political science, anthropology, you bring in ethnic studies, right? Women's and gender and sexuality studies, right? Like, so I think if we thought more along those lines, instead of just, okay, Department of Political Science, Department of History, I actually think that would be to the benefit, not just of our scholarship and intellectual lives, but to the benefit of how do we address these incredibly vexing and really disturbing problems in society today, right? And that kind of is another answer to that question, which is, I do think we have to move away from the academy's fixation on being objective and universalist and detached,
Mm.
to establish legitimacy and currency. I just think we have to move away from that and really think about, no, like the core of ethnic studies, right? And why I think some of the best work is being done in ethnic studies is that the engagement of the community with what we theorize and with what we empirically analyze, right, is absolutely important. And, I think when you have those community engaged forms of knowledge production, right, that better informs policy or how activists kind of think and act on the ground, and vice versa, right? That communities direct our research questions and our projects, and think of things in ways we never would have thought of, right? And so, I actually think that would force us to be interdisciplinary, right? Because they're not going to say, oh, well, I'm not only going to, interpret this from the frame of, what Asia studies says, right? Like, it kind of really makes those rigid, silos or those rigid boxes, we bust through them, and be more malleable.
So you're talking about academia making a stronger kind of connection to the community around us, and
Yes.
by
Yeah.
focusing our research questions not necessarily on theory per se for itself, but in what is actually going on and how to address these questions.
Yeah, like street theory, right? Street science, right? These activists taught me, I never would have asked the question prior to this study, why is classism the master injustice, right,
Mhm.
for these Latinx and Mexican immigrants? It was because I worked with them that became a question to even
Mhm.
ask, right? And that comes from their own street, experience. And street, street is obviously like figurative, but you know what I'm saying, right?
Right.
Um,
Your
and
embodied experiences.
Exactly, the embodied experiences, both physical and emotionally, that that's what they arrive at. And so I think, even when I approached them for my research, I said, are there any specific questions that you've been wanting to explore? And, they're so busy and resource strapped that, they don't necessarily have time to think about that. They've got, one schedule ahead of the other, to contend with. But, I do think that is the type of direction we should be moving in. And just to say quickly, I do think if we had been more like that, I think the academy wouldn't have been so flat-footed when it came to the rise of Trump.
Mm.
That's one of the books that I'm writing, or I'm going to start writing soon, is that I do think the academy, and sociology in particular, that's what I focus on in the manuscript, is it was just flat-footed when it came to the rise of Trump, when it came to the George Floyd protests, the anti-Asian American violence because of COVID-19. I don't think they were prepared for that. Yeah.
So Jack Cohen, who is also in our class, he asks, you mentioned that US views itself as a classless society.
Yeah.
Do you think if the US did view themselves as separate classes, it would help create more equality?
Um, well, I would start off by saying if the United States fully acknowledged that capitalism creates unequal classes, and it creates accumulation of wealth and the exploitation of those lower, then I think we're in that right direction, right? But because the power of capitalism, just like the power of whiteness and lots of other things, right, are in their invisibility,
Mhm.
um, or it's just the deleterious attributes and consequences, right, that are erased. All the virtues of capitalism are extolled ad nauseum, right? Oh, it allows anyone to be, rich like Jeff Bezos, and you can be freewheeling and creative, and you can do whatever you want, and innovative, and all. Those are all the virtues of capitalism extolled, right? Look, it's the only successful political economy. Look at communism and socialism, but if we really talked about the labor exploitation, right? The way racism is mediated by capitalism as well, right? The environmental destruction that we're suffering right now, that I just think that it would allow people to see that, wow, maybe capitalism does cause some problems, right? Maybe we do need a social welfare state because capitalism breeds all these injustices and inequalities. And yeah, maybe I should be fighting the 1% and not just blaming immigrants and other groups of color for many of the ills bred by capitalism, right? I think that would be a good direction to go in.
So Amanda Abner has two questions. How do we discuss the issue of discrimination and racism with people who deny it? How
Mm,
can we prove discrimination is happening or promote healthy conversations to improve equality between minority groups in relation to dominant white society? She also
yeah.
asks, has isolating and congregating minority groups in particular regions in a city been a key factor in causing environmental justice in the US? Is it
Mm-hmm.
making it easier for pollutant industrial plants in these particular regions to cause harm to a predominant minority group? And because we're running out of time, I'm going to ask you the final question, which is by Irene Lee. She asks, is there anything that we can do to take action and ensure that people don't have to suffer from these environments and are treated equally? Do you think if ordinary people started to take action, it would have a big enough effect that it would alleviate a lot of the suffering and negative effects that people from lower income areas experience, like pollution?
Okay, so there are a lot of questions there. Let me just start with the last one, and then hopefully I'll work backwards and see if I can remember all of them. Yeah, absolutely. We can be going into the communities and talking to them and finding out what the struggles are and embodying the communities like they ask us to, right? And that's why one part of my book is that they really see at least those political officials and those who are, from more privileged communities or backgrounds, who come in and try to embody their community and try to understand by smelling, breathing, seeing, right? That's really important to them, right? Listening to them, that's an act of emotional labor, right? And being there for them, right? There are all kinds of different ways, big and small, that we can assist the struggle, right? And I think that also letting them lead, listening to them and following their tactics and their strategies and why um, they think that they're the most effective or the most appropriate. I think letting them lead first, and then obviously later, once you establish rapport and relationships and trust, then it can be more negotiable. But I do think it's really important when you establish relationships with communities, that we don't come in with some kind of savior complex, or we don't come in as know-it-alls, or people with all the we have to let them lead, right? Um, and some of their strategies, for example, involve making sure that there's self-care, making sure that there's communal care, right? That there's joy, that there's also fun and activism, right? When I was organizing, yeah, a lot of times it just wasn't fun. And so, like helping coordinate social events, taking care of their kids, right? Bringing in food, right? Food is not something that low income people take for granted. So yeah, so obviously there's all the regular ways like, mass mobilizations, pressuring the elites and all of that. Like, I'm assuming you already know those standard ways, but I think when they center on ethics of care, it really teaches us to kind of think of other ways in which activism also happens, right? Um, as far as is residential racial segregation, yeah, one of the reasons why so much of this pollution gets concentrated against these communities, absolutely, right? One of the enduring legacies of white supremacy and systemic racism is residential segregation of people and immigrants of color. And that's why these communities that I studied, especially the working class Latinx communities, they're so segregated, right? Carson does have a lot of people of color, but it's a little bit more multiracial, multiple groups of color, and then some whites. But yeah, I mean, the whole landscape of most cities is determined by historic and ongoing segregation, gentrification, lack of housing, etc. So I can't remember what the first question was, Sharon. Can you just summarize it for me? Sorry.
Sure. We only have 1 minute, but She's,
Uh-huh.
she says, how do we discuss the issue of discrimination
Oh,
and
yes.
racism with people who deny it?
Okay, if people are going to wholesale deny it, just don't bother with them, okay? Honestly, like you need to preserve your mental health as well. But if people seem open, they're open to read some things, right? And listen. What I would do is I would simply talk about the history of this country, right? Because no one can deny that there was genocide against indigenous tribes. Like no one can deny that there was enslavement, right? No one can deny that there was exclusions of immigrants simply based on their race. So you bring all that up, and then what you do is you tie it to contemporary examples and issues, right? That the police actually came out of slave patrols, right? That violence is analogous, right? That indigenous peoples today suffering environmental injustice, like the DAPL, right? That actually also comes from the decimation of their lands prior. So I think making that connection to things that they can't deny at least allows them to wake up a little.
Great. Thank you so much for wrapping it up so quickly. And thank you also so much for, enlightening us with making visible the invisible harms of pollution and climate change and environmental injustice. Our next lecture in this series features a talk by Jeremy Wallace, who is an associate professor of government at Cornell University. And this talk will be held on Thursday, October 14th at 3:30 via Zoom. So more information can be found at asia.nd.edu. Thank you all for attending this lecture and have a nice day.
Thank you.